Peggy 12.
Wyatt.
Arcade Paradise obviously is its own game, but it features 35 plus arcade games within it, which, to be honest, from a development point of view, is an absolute nightmare.
With the idea of making 35 games, we kind of had to chop it up into kind of having individual people come up with ideas for games and kind of build them in.
Everyone gets to kind of go off and say, right, you're going to make this game now, or you're going to make, these couple of different games, and they are also different, so you could be working on 3 different games within Arcade Paradise, the game, at the same time.
There's a lot of work has gone into each one of the games, so balancing each one, bug fixing in each one. We've got an achievement system within each game, so each game has its own achievements and stuff.
And it was quite a challenge for the team to make kind of that many, but it does mean that we've all had our own sort of inspirations that have gone into each one.
So they all feel really different. Some are written 2 years ago by a graduate in their first job in the industry, and some have been written by somebody who's been doing it for 25 years. So you really get the personality of the games and the people that made them coming through, and it makes it feel a lot more unique.
In terms of deciding what the games we wanted to put in were, that was pretty much just whatever we fancied. Some of them are games that I used to play. The first game I ever played is in there, which was a game on VIC-20 called Blitz. In our game it's called UFO Assault, and you're playing this little UFO that's dropping bombs on a city. Other people had favourite games, and obviously there's some games that are just, you have to have them in an arcade or else it wouldn't be a real arcade. So, we're kind of trying to represent that stuff. But a lot of the time it was just like, oh, wouldn't it be cool to try this out? So we'd do a real quick prototype and just, if it worked, we'd be like, cool, awesome, let's get that in there and, polish it up and get it feeling good. I think one of the things that was quite nice was that we didn't have to just do arcade games. Obviously today's audience is maybe has a slightly different expectation of games, so obviously all these old arcades are there to take your quarters or your pence. Today's audiences want something slightly different, so we've had to kind of balance that.
A lot of people, myself included, have a lot of nostalgia for old kind of arcade games. But when we go back to play them, we often find that they're quite clunkily controlled. There's things that nowadays we wouldn't accept in a game. So we've taken our own kind of modern twist on that, made it all work on modern controls so that it feels really good to play each one, even if kind of going back to an actual cabinet, it wouldn't be quite the same experience. We think that's actually improved the game quite a lot compared to if it was just kind of a collection of arcade cabinets.
So we've had to do quite a lot in terms of making the games feel quite authentic, but actually be much more modern. Obviously with us building the games from the ground up has been a much easier task because, quite a few of our games are pretty much modern games with just a slightly older looking aesthetic. For us it was really important to almost more important to convey the feeling of the arcade, that buzz from the CRT screens and the reflections of the neon and being able to see the screens are just a little bit crappy, they're not super crisp and super sharp. That was from the outset one of the really important things for me.
The soundtrack, we've got all these great 90s era sounding bands across a load of different genres, and we've tried to keep each machine is making its own bleeps and blips, which again is kind of era appropriate, so that kind of grounds the player in the world immediately.
Ashley, as a character who the player plays, can alter how the arcade feels by moving machines around. You put nice machines next to maybe the slightly older ones or unpopular ones to try and reincorporate that arcade feeling.
It all kind of sells that idea that you're in this physical space and it's really there. And having kind of opening and closing times helps with that. Just psychologically, you're like, oh, it's closing time.
We weren't sure that we were going to add characters, and that did end up being something that is now in-game. The bigger the arcade gets, the further down in the game that the player progresses, the more people you'll see in the arcade, and it makes the arcade feel whole.
From the sort of personal perspective of what I want the game to feel like to a player, Like, a lot of it is to do with the fact that I did have some really terrible dead-end jobs, like back in the day, you know, working in kitchens and this and that and the other. And you're sort of daydreaming while you're washing pots up and, you know, cooking someone's food for them. You're kind of daydreaming about, you know, what games you would make and this, that and the other. And I thought, if we can kind of create that same sort of vibe, that feeling of going into... Actually, do you know what? You just asked me that question and it's just come to me. So I worked in Switzerland in the hospital kitchen while I was like on my summer holidays. And I used to spend loads of my money in this dedicated arcade just to the side of this pub. And we couldn't go into the pub, even though, you know, obviously we're 16, so we tried. But we could go into the arcade and I used to spend absolutely loads. I've totally forgotten about that. I reckon if you could take me back there, it wouldn't look dissimilar to Arcade Paradise. It's just literally just clicked now. This is set in the fictional town of Grindstone.
A dead-end town in generic America in 1993.
You're listening to 802 The Grindstone, the sharpest station this side of the Mississippi.
The 90s as an era is probably a good time for the game to be set.